Hi, Patrick. Thank you so much for joining us today. Your new book, Apple in China, is the best book I have read this year. I have read several books about Apple before, mostly focused on Stephen Jobs, Johnny Ive, Tony Fadell, and those iconic figures. And I think make your book so unique is how you use storytelling to explore the complex relationship between Apple and China.
Yeah.
You're really a masterful storyteller, the way you weave together all those things, different narrative about Apple's people and operations, simultaneously moving between Taiwan, China, and the US. Throughout reading is I keep learning new things and it is genuinely a page turner. But what's
Thank you.
really struck me with is that this feeling is like the untold story of Taiwan's massive role in global tech. So let's dive into the angle today. I want to start by understanding your journey as a reporter and writer. So can you briefly introduce yourself, your background?
So I'm Canadian and I went to school in Toronto to study religion. And my joke about that is if when you study religion, I mean, you don't graduate with any job offers. There's nothing for you to do. It's just an interesting degree and you've got interesting stories for cocktail parties, but there's no job prospects. So, I could learn, or sorry, I knew how to read, write, maybe think, maybe, I don't know, delve into topics. So in a weird way, I guess I was a decent background for journalism, but I didn't do any internships or any of the things that Americans tend to prioritize. I hadn't studied anything practical like statistics. So I sort of fell into journalism. This is around 2007 in Canada. And I ended up becoming like a macroeconomics reporter, which I didn't love and probably would have been dull, except, of course, within a few months of joining, the credit crisis began, and a year later, Lehman Brothers collapsed. And it turned out that my sort of learning curve was just kind of a year ahead of so many people that just had to catch up to speed with Wall Street and investment banking. And so I ended up just taking on a job I probably wouldn't have cared for, but at a time of global financial crisis. And long story short, that sort of led me to being a bond reporter at the Wall Street Journal. And I had this reputation for coming in every day and grabbing the pink paper, the Financial Times. And I think somehow that trickled out to the Financial Times. And so when they needed to hire somebody for a new job, something that they called Fast FT, I don't know if you'd be familiar with it. It was maybe around for 6 or 7 years, but the idea was sort of that I think we were trying to speed up the pace of what you would see on ft.com. So often you'd go there in the morning and you find great stories that you hadn't seen if you were there the day before, but then maybe by noon, it was kind of the same homepage. And so Fast FT was sort of an attempt to bring some of the FT writing, but in a really quick way to cover markets sort of as they happened. So I did that out of Hong Kong for 3 years, which is really it wasn't my first time to Asia. It was my first time my career had taken me to Asia. And I got to cover everything. I mean, a lot of central bank stories, currency stories, everything to do with stocks and corporate earnings. But it wasn't just Hong Kong, it was China, Japan, all the way down to Australia, most of Southeast Asia. So just like it was like getting an undergrad degree in East Asian studies or something, just by being there as a reporter for 3 years. And it coincided with Xi Jinping's first term. And so, the umbrella revolution in Hong Kong, where, people 10, 15 years younger than me were sort of, I was looking up to them. They were fighting for, democracy or independence or a range of things in Hong Kong. And so it was a really inspiring time to be there, but a tragic time as well, because it didn't seem like their hopes were going to be fulfilled. And indeed, they were not. I moved to Germany to cover the Volkswagen scandal and also just German industry, which really means the car industry. And that was pretty fascinating because that was, the Germans have the most to lose in the changing world of automotive, where all the things that are sort of imposing themselves into the car world aren't German. In other words, ride hailing, electrification, connectivity, and self-driving. Those are basically not even American technologies. Those are basically California technologies, right? The companies involved are Google, Uber, Apple made an attempt, and so forth. And then I moved over to cover Apple. And so Steve Jobs often talks about, you never understand your life as it goes, but you can connect the dots looking backwards. And so for me, the origin of the book wasn't just covering Apple. It was living in Hong Kong, studying supply chains in Germany, and then covering Apple, right? It was the culmination of those three things that led to, I guess, having a sort of unique take on Apple history, and the company's future.
Yeah. And I hear from someone who used to work at Human AI, and he mentioned that you have been doing this deep dive interview for years, like really get into the weeds of how contract manufacturing actually work. And the book is clearly a long journey for you. Was there like a light bulb moment during your research where you thought, this is the right time, right story I need to tell?
Yeah, it's funny. I wouldn't say that the book came out of like successfully covering Apple for 4 years. It more emerged from failing to cover Apple for 3 of those 4 years, and then a final year of really getting into how Apple manufactures its products and realizing that that's obviously a big part of the company. I mean, they're a hardware company at heart, but we don't treat them as such. We just treat them as a company that has these products, and we ignore, the English phrase is like how the sausage gets made, right? And insofar as that story had been told at all, it was always a story of, how do I put this? Like, China would enter the picture in a story to explain a problem, right? There would be allegations of Uyghur labor. There were famously some suicides at Foxconn 2010, 2011. There was always a problem that people pointed to say, there's some wrong part of the narrative. But that's really interesting, right? Because China is such a reason for Apple's success, not its failures. I mean, China is the secret sauce of how the company pulls off its operations. And it's sort of obvious once you begin to think about it that operations are like the bread and butter of Apple. Because when Steve Jobs passes away, there's no contest over who's going to be CEO. It's the head of operations, right? It's the chief operating officer. It's Tim Cook. And he's not that exciting as a figure. I don't mean that as a criticism. I just mean as a journalist, Tim Cook has never tweeted anything interesting in his life. As a boss, he's competence incarnate. I mean, he's done a magnificent job building the most sophisticated supply chain on the planet. You can't take that away from him. Although, I mean, I criticize it in various respects. And we'll get to that. But my favorite saying about journalism is we cover all of the plane crashes and none of the landings. And I don't think there's really been a deep dive into Apple's history this century. The exception would be something like a biography, like the biography of Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson. But that's not a history of Apple. That's a biography of someone that built Apple. But the only explanation I have as to why that's the case is that it's one big plane landing, right? In other words, journalists are not attracted to a story of someone leads a company to greatness. You need some tension. You need something else. And the realization that Apple had consolidated its operations all into one country and then was sort of forced to acquiesce as it doubled down, as that country became more authoritarian and belligerent, where you have a sort of Putin-esque figure taking on an unprecedented third term. That was where the tension lived, and that became really interesting. And I didn't think it was being given due attention. And so, sorry to give such a long-winded answer. The last thing I'll say is that I wrote 2 articles, sort of back-to-back, what are called big reads in the FT. So an article that takes up an entire page. It's called the big read. And we had 2 back-to-back. And I was really excited about those articles. But by the time they were actually published, I knew that I was just scratching the surface of a much, much wider story. And so I was actually, by the time they were published, maybe a little disappointed, maybe a little ho-hum about how they would be received, because I had a feeling that I was just telling what I could, but that there was so much more to tell. And so I wondered if the reaction was just going to be like, this doesn't say anything new at all. And instead, the reaction was kind of wild, and people thought it was great. And people with Apple experience reached out to say, like, this is the first article that's really cracked the code on like why the China relationship is so significant. And that just got me so optimistic that if something that I was in a sense disappointed by could have that reaction, then if I take 12 months off and just do nothing but talk to people that lived this story, there's a big book to be written there. It was a really ambitious book. I mean, I was intimidated by, as my agent puts it, covering the most NDA'd company on the planet and specifically focusing on its operations in the second most important economy in the world, famously opaque in its governance. And how are you supposed to tell the tale of that relationship? But somehow it worked out really well, and so I'm thrilled by the result. I'll try to give my next answer not to be a 5-minute answer. My apologies.
It's okay. I think you can really tell how much research you did for this book. I mean, you even read Rival Partners this book, and this book is by Jimmy Wu, which is the deep academic study about how Taiwanese entrepreneur and Guangdong official basically create the China development model together. That book is incredibly detailed, but not exactly light reading. And when you
Yeah.
were dig into this research, were you surprised to find out that Taiwan, especially Foxconn or Honghai, Terry Guo was actually the secret sauce behind the whole story? And like, do you think Apple's China success wouldn't have been impossible without these Taiwanese companies?
Fascinating question. I mean, the role of the Taiwanese entrepreneurs, am I getting it right by saying Taishung, the Taishung, in mainland China is phenomenal. Now, I wouldn't say, I mean, look, it's not a well-known story, but there are at least 3 books published since 2017 in English. So the Rival Partners is one. And by the way, you've got a more interesting cover than the copy that I have. I can maybe go find it for you. It's not as sexy as the one that you posted. Um, there's Making Money, which is generally about entrepreneurs. It's more about the apparel industry. I can't think of the third, but even as I introduced in the prologue, Xi Jinping has thanked Taiwanese entrepreneurs for really building the industrial capacity of China, which is ironic and really interesting. And my God, is there a lot more to explore there? And as your viewers in Taiwan will know, there's a lot of interesting questions about why it is that Taiwanese entrepreneurs would build up, in a sense, not in a sense, quite directly, the winners of the Civil War from 75 years ago. Right? That's a that's a tension-filled relationship. Anyway, so that's in the book, but probably not in the sort of detail and depth that a Taiwanese reader might want. But I became fascinated by that. I was absolutely surprised by the role that the Taiwanese played. I knew some of that. I think everyone covering Apple knows that Pegatron, Wistron, Quanta, and Foxconn are Taiwanese, but maybe they haven't thought necessarily about what that means. What are the implications of that? I'll tell you one fascinating thing that blew my mind, which is that in the first 4 years of the Apple Foxconn relationship, it does go back to the late 80s, early 90s, but I mean the first 4 years of true partnership in 2000 to 2003, Foxconn made more money, both in terms of profits and in terms of profit margins. And the more closely that Foxconn works with Apple, the higher Apple profit margins go, and the lower Foxconn's margins go. I mean, the closer, it's almost an ironclad rule. The closer you work with Apple, the lower your margins are going to be, or the greater they will collapse. And that's really interesting because it helps you understand the psychology of the Apple engineers who looked around and thought, wow, are we powerful? I don't use this quote in the book, but one of them said to me, the red carpet was rolled out for us everywhere we went, right? The suppliers were just desperate for our deals. And the thing that I find so interesting is I don't think they questioned why that was the case. And of course, it's because Terry Guo was brilliant at this, and the Chinese later are brilliant at this, is that they recognize that the technology transfer of working with Apple is extraordinary. And so they will work sometimes without pay. They will make investments without Apple even asking them to, because they're getting something better than money. They're getting intangible, tacit know-how, experiential know-how, tuition-free on-the-ground training. People would compare Apple engineering training to the Ivy League equivalent of hardware. So in other words, Terry Guo gets that. I don't know that Apple got that, right? They just saw low prices and they thought, wow, this is great. These people are willing to work for so cheaply. And I don't think they'd recognize the degree to which they were just sort of gifting away manufacturing expertise. And it's a 2020 hindsight thing. You can only see that looking back 25 years later. But that's what makes the story, I think, so incredible. Not my telling of the story, but like the actual lived experience of how this all plays out. And then I try to do that as best as I can. But I'm trying to say it's not my wording of the story. It's the actual experience of how this played out that I think is just mind-boggling and fascinating.
And that was the concept you mentioned in your book is Apple squeeze, right?
Yeah, I I don't know that it's right to say that I coined this, but I just want to say a few reviews have tried to say that the Apple squeeze is like the internal language that is used by Cupertino. So I just want to distance myself from that. I'm coming up with a term for it. maybe it ends up getting used, and then I could lay claim to coining it. But at the moment, that's just my way of saying. Apple will say to its supplier, look, we're not going to pay you a whole lot. You're going to get very squeezed on the margins, but what you will get in return is so much greater than profits. It's all this know-how. But that didn't become explicit until, as far as I know anyway, 2015, 2016. But Terry Guo understood that as early as 1999, because you have to understand that when Terry Guo makes a big bet on assembling the candy-colored iMacs, he is taking away the business of LG. That's his big bet. So sorry, just to back up a little bit, the Bondi Blue iMac, if readers can, or listeners can remember, totally redefined the aesthetics of what a computer could look like. This is Johnny Ive's first massive creation with Steve Jobs, and it's assembled by LG in Korea. And at the time, Apple basically did its own assembly, and they would operate on 3 different continents. And so when LG was really successful, they were asked to replicate that strategy. So they operate in Mexico and I tell those stories, and it's really quite interesting. But when Foxconn comes on board to compete with LG, they're asked to do the same thing. So they ended up being, of course, in China, where they already had significant operations, but also in Czech Republic. I don't think anybody really knows about, but Foxconn built products for Apple for about 10, maybe 11 years, till 2010 for Apple. In the Czech Republic, and then also in Fullerton, California, which isn't significant in terms of how many products would say, assembled in California, but it's really significant in terms of the proximity to Cupertino. That's where a lot of the lessons we're learning. A lot of the training was going on. Where am I going with this? So when Terry Guo makes this bet, Apple is still considered a has-been, a near bankrupt company. Okay, they've got this one-hit product, but versus the volumes of the PC world, we're still talking it's maybe 4% of the market, right? 5% of the market. It's not intuitive that one should go work with Apple. And the other Taiwanese entrepreneurs shunned Apple. They basically saw it as a demanding, arrogant company that asked you to do all these things, and you didn't get paid much in response. There were no big bonuses if you were working the Apple line at the Taiwanese contract manufacturers. So Terry Guo really understood something different about Apple. And, I would love for there to be a deeper dive into the history and psychology of Terry Guo. There's never been a major biography of him, but I think he's a fascinating person who, of course, ends up running for president of Taiwan. So I would love to know way more about him, right? I don't use this line in the book, but I consider him the Henry Ford of Asia.
Yeah, you just talk about the question I will ask is, when Terry Guo decided to reverse engineering the iMac in 1999, Apple only had 3 or 4% market share and was nearly bankrupt. What do you think about was the logic behind Terry Guo's decision? Just try to reverse anything to prove them can do it. And do you think it was more based on the faith in Apple's technical capability or confidence in Steve Jobs personally?
Yeah, I think there was this sense that if you could fulfill Apple's demands, you could fill anybody's demands, because nobody was as demanding as Apple. And this gets into some wonky engineering to understand it, but for the layperson, I would just say, just remember how creative and different the aesthetics of the candy-colored iMac were versus every computer that had come out in the prior 15 years, and frankly, the following 15 years. I mean, it really was just a crazily different product. And so it required all sorts of plastic injection molding that had just never been done before. But in addition to that, it's the engineering tolerances. Apple would define things within microns of what the standard would be, and there was engineers would talk to me with these interesting ways. They would say Apple would do things in a way that engineering school would say you never do. In other words, when you're designing a product and two parts have to piece together, you would always have certain number of millimeters or maybe it's microns depending on the product. You'd give it a certain amount of latitude so that when mistakes were inevitably made in the manufacturing process, things would fit together. And that's just standard procedure. But Apple wouldn't do that because Apple wants perfection, and that's what they go after. So again, someone like Quanta would just be like, "Why would we want to work with you? This is terrible." No one likes being sort of bullied the way that a Hollywood version of Steve Jobs sort of bullies people. But Terry just sort of understood that what we are learning from Apple is just unparalleled, and we need to take as many orders as we can. So I quote someone from Apple saying, I think Terry saw a vision of Apple earlier than people at Apple did, which is kind of an astonishing statement.
Yeah, and that was the question I'm really curious about. The question behind this book is how Terry Guo in that moment seeing the older things, like got that vision on Apple, and Apple turning down today is it's hard to imagine in that moment. So does this training for profit model have any precedent in business history? Or would you say reflect that dual meaning of Foxconn? Is there more than the name just Foxes and connectors?
It's a great question, but I don't know that I know the answer. It would have to be some academic who studied corporate history. I don't know other examples, but part of it is that at least if we confine ourselves to the PC industry, I mean, it's sort of obvious to anybody that nobody was doing what Apple was doing. I mean, the beige box computer is the thing for the prior 10 years, right? Like I joke to people like, what's your favorite Dell or HP computer from the early 2000s? Because nobody has one. But we could spend half an hour talking about our favorite Apple computers from the early 2000s. I mean, several chapters in the first book are really just going through all the things that they were doing. So, in that sense, it's absolutely unprecedented because nobody has that like Steve Jobs DNA in the company that just demands perfection, even when it comes to like the layout of the circuit board that's inside the computer that the customer is never going to see. I mean, Apple would care about things like the coloring of the wires inside the computer. And it didn't matter that no one was going to see them. Like that still mattered to Apple. And so much of what the book is about is Apple sort of transplanting not just the engineering skills to Asia and then later into China in particular, but the culture, right? The culture of caring, of it mattering that even though this is the back of the computer, we're not going to allow like the two pieces of metal to come together and for there to be a knit line. I don't talk about this in the book, but this is a specific example where there was this knit line on the back of the Sunflower iMac when they did the plastic injection molding, I think it was. And what customer would ever complain about this? But it was totally unacceptable, and they had to do prototype after prototype before they came up with a new method that could put the enclosure together without that line. Other companies just don't care about that kind of stuff. But by teaching it, by inculcating it to what ends up being tens of millions of people, maybe I'm overstating that. I mean, it is tens of millions of people, but the specific lessons, I'm sure that's more to tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. But there's just like a cultural transformation that takes place in hundreds of factories across China as a result of Apple's absolute insistence that this is how a project is going to be done.
And speaking of the relationship, your book mentioned that the China government literally subsidies the shadow out of Terry Guo. I love that quote. And they are providing land, buildings, infrastructure, the workers. What made China government so willing to roll out the red carpet specifically for Terry Guo? And was the kind of government support a complete game changer for Taiwanese manufacturer? Could company from other country have worked in and gotten the same deal, or was there something unique Taiwanese about this whole setup?
Okay, so I don't want to lose the listener here because I think the answer is a little bit wonky, but this relates to the difference between an OEM and an ODM. So in the late 1990s, all the Taiwanese contract manufacturers wanted to be ODMs, original design manufacturers. So design is the key. They would hire more expensive engineers to actually come up with the look and feel and substance of the computer, the kind of thing that Johnny Ive would do, right? And then they would actually just build like these catalogs where someone from IBM or HP could just like select from page 27 and say, yep, that's what we want. And then the Taiwanese would create it and sort of badge it with IBM or HP or whatever. So the computers weren't really like designed or really built by these Western brands, but maybe they had, delivered some specs and things like that. But in terms of the look and feel, the Taiwanese ODMs were doing this. Now, the reason they were doing that is because if you're a Western company, it's brilliant to have somebody take care of the manufacturing. I mean, that just means you don't have to have factories, you don't have to have workers, you don't have to consider so much allocation and resources. Someone just takes care of that. So by being an ODM, you're offering even more to these Western PC brands, right? They don't have to have an R&D department. They don't have to have a design department. And so it makes things more and more lucrative for those companies. So being an OEM, original equipment manufacturer, doesn't have those more expensive workers. And so it was sort of shunned, that model. That was sort of considered like the older model, but that's all Foxconn wanted to do. And this ends up being perfect to be a partner to Apple because, of course, Apple's never going to outsource the research and development or the design of their computers. That's fundamental to who the company is, and they're unique in that respect. And so Foxconn ends up being this partner that's perfect because they will move heaven and earth to respond to Apple's demands. And crucially, they will never use those skills to then build their own computer and label it Foxconn, right? But that is what the other Taiwanese manufacturers are doing, right? The origins of companies like ASUS and Acer, yeah, thank you. Those companies. I will talk to people at Apple now who will say the reason ASUS and Acer are so good in laptops is that we trained them for 5 years in the late 90s into the early 2000s, right? There could be arrogance behind that. Like, I don't attribute that to me, but that is what they say. That's the effect, the impact of Apple's training, which is hilarious. But the point, of course, is that if you're Compaq and you're choosing out of a catalog, and then the supplier then brands their own product to compete with you, that's not a great situation to be in, especially as you are losing your skills, they are gaining the skills. And then what happens when there's a supply shortage? Well, they probably are going to supply themselves rather than you. So by taking the less lucrative route of being an OEM, what Terry Guo has to do to sort of make up for it, because it's not high margin, is to vertically integrate. So people tend to think of Foxconn as a final assembler. In other words, once all the pieces are put together, once all the pieces are made, Foxconn sort of puts it all together and puts it in a box. But they do a lot more than that. They do all kinds of plastic injection molding and metal stamping and a host, a number of things. And so they sort of become like the central point of an industrial cluster where you got the final assembly in the middle, and then surrounding the factory are all these other things that Foxconn is doing, and their work attracts all these other suppliers, and so you end up with just like a massive supply base. I mean, there's actually some videos on YouTube where you can look at Zhengzhou, which is known as iPhone City. I mean, not the whole city, but the portion of Zhengzhou called iPhone City, which is where Foxconn does about half of all iPhone production today. And, Apple goes there, I want to say in 2000, the deal signed in 2010. I think they go there around 2014. And I mean, the city is transformed by Apple's presence there because you end up having dozens, perhaps hundreds of suppliers doing every facet of the iPhone, but also, multiple suppliers are vying for the Apple orders and such. And so, Zhengzhou alone for Foxconn has 400,000 workers there at peak season. So with all the other people, I think you're upwards of 1 million workers. So you can, the city I grew up in, which is one of Canada's bigger cities, has 1 million people in it, right? I mean, so that's how instrumental in sort of like nation building Apple's operations are, that like an entire 1 million person industrial cluster gets built just out of Terry Guo saying, hey, I want to build more iPhones and I'm going to do it inland rather than in Shenzhen. So anyways, I'm getting way ahead of the narrative here. The reason I was going on about the OEM thing is that when Foxconn decides to vertically integrate, what that means is that they need more real estate, right? They need more space to build these industrial clusters, right? So they're not just doing the final assembly, they're doing all these other things, which means they need more people, they need more factories. And how do you build factories in China? How do you get people from the hinterlands in China? You have to work with the local officials. So Foxconn, and Terry Guo in particular, end up being brilliant in drawing in foreign direct investment and then working with the local cadres to basically incentivize them to give them free machinery, free land, access to migrant labor, and so forth, because the Chinese communist system is actually quite dynamic in a way that, frankly, a Western system isn't. So I'll just fast forward to today. Are you familiar with the book Abundance by Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein? It's a book about how like we are our own worst enemies insofar as like we need to build more stuff. We need to build factories. We need to build affordable housing and so forth. And the cause of like, let's say I'm in California, the cause of like us not being able to do that is not Republicans. It's our own laws and regulations, environmental standards and processes that take forever. And so Anyway, the point of of why I'm bringing this up is that they point out this brilliant example. I mean, it's really depressing, but like if you want to build a big real estate project here, if you have local bureaucrats join in other words, if you have public funding come in, what they point out is that that comes with more requirements. It actually slows down the process. In China, and I'm talking 25 years ago, but it should be true today as well, is the total opposite. If you get the local cadres on board, right, the local sort of cadres of the Communist Party, they act more like a venture capitalist who sits on your board, cuts red tape, allows you to do what you need to do, and so forth. And so Terry Guo ends up being like this brilliant practitioner of understanding how to get one city or state to vie against the other and really build out his factories. So most of it's in Shenzhen in the 80s and 90s, but eventually he expands to at least 4, 5, 6 different locations across China. And the reason why is that he's really incentivizing the local cadres and sort of working within the dynamic capitalist system that the Chinese built. So that ends up being absolutely critical to Apple. I mean, I can't tell you how many times this story would happen so often that when I had so many instances of it in my book, my editor was like, "I think we get the point. Like, we don't need another example." And I think we cut some examples. But what kept happening is, let's say Apple would realize like, oh, demand for this product is going to be even greater than we thought. So we're going to need another production line. And so they would go tell Foxconn that, only to find out that Foxconn had already determined that that was going to be the case. And then like they'd walk around the corner and like, here's the production line. We've already created it for you. And this would blow the minds of Apple. And of course, Foxconn's doing that for like the selfish reason that like, if we get to max capacity and Apple makes that decision, maybe they're going to go with Pegatron if we haven't already built it for them. So there was a brilliance on the part of Terry Guo to always get ahead of the client, right? To anticipate their needs rather than just respond to what they say. And so he's a bit of a gambler in that sense. And the most sort of significant time he does this is that in 2010, he meets with Tim Cook. And this is the iPad has just come out. The iPhone 4, which goes bonkers in China, is about to come out. And they have a discussion about what the unit volumes are going to be. And Terry Guo thinks Tim Cook's numbers are just like way too conservative. And he says, "You're sandbagging me. Like the numbers are going to be multiples of what you're saying." And so he says to Tim Cook basically on the spot, and there's like a handshake agreement here, "I think the volumes are going to be way higher. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work with Chinese public officials in 2 different cities. And this ends up being Chengdu and Zhengzhou. And I'm going to build entire factories for you there, factory towns for you there. And if I'm right, I get all the orders for that expansion." And that's exactly what happens. And those 2 places are now known as iPad City and iPhone City. So just like absolutely tremendous bet on the part of Terry Guo. The last thing I should say, especially in the 80s and the 90s, and then it changes in the 2000s, not only is Terry building the factories, but he's building dormitories, right? Famously, I think, for all these workers. And so imagine if you're the local cadre who's judged by the growth of your city, you've got somebody that's bringing in foreign direct investment, factories, dormitories, entertainment venues, grocery stores. I mean, he's just building an entire little economy, quite big economy in a country that's famous for its growth during this time. But Shenzhen is the city of all cities in terms of its growth, right? We go from 70,000 people in 1980 to 7 million people in 2007. So 100-fold growth. And the journalist James Fallows says that, reason number 1 in terms of people is Deng Xiaoping. Reason number 2 is Terry Guo. That's fascinating. But what we have to remember is that who's Terry Guo working for, as it were? Apple is their largest client from 2000 to today.
Yeah, and specifically the China model of massive government subsidies while simultaneously training up domestic industry. Is that flexible in India or Vietnam? What obstacle do you think that would face to replicate that approach, especially Guangdong mode?
So many facets. Just to give a shorter answer than I've been giving you, I think there's 2 things. So we're fast forwarding the narrative a little bit, so I hope that's okay. The Chinese rightfully see the iPhone as an indigenous product. It was born there, right? From before it became a product in 2005, 2006. Chinese suppliers have been there from the get-go. Basically, all the phones really ever made from Apple have been made in China, with tens of millions of workers, hundreds of factories. Even if the factories aren't Chinese, they're typically located in China. Um, and so the more that Apple decides to de-risk from China uh, by moving their operations to India in particular, which of course has a pretty contentious history with China, the more that Apple risks being seen as the poster child for Western decoupling from China. That's a terrible image for Apple, right? So I would, advocate that Apple accelerate its diversification from India, but I'm the first person to say that. I mean, as much as I want to see that, it's going to be an immediate problem for a $70 billion business that they have. Anytime you give any number related to China or Apple, you have to give some context because the numbers are so big that we can't understand it. So the one that I like to give for here is this: there's only 12 companies in the world that have more than $10 billion business in China, and Apple has nearly 70 billion. So it is far and away the largest. So to do something in the supply chain that might upset a $70 billion business is like a big no-no. This is partly why I call the company captured, right? They're sort of encircled by Chinese operations, and it makes it really difficult for them to move. So if you play the game Go, you can sort of see the metaphor I'm stealing from Henry Kissinger here. The other reason, of course, is Beijing knows sort of better than any other world government the value of manufacturing, whether it's the value creation, the job creation, the sort of trickle down effect from having those kinds of jobs. Right? I mean, Xi Jinping calls like app economy stuff the fictitious economy, right? He's a real hard hat kind of guy. And so he doesn't want to see those jobs leave to India. And so since I finished writing the book, there have been at least 3 major stories of problems where the Chinese people with experiential know-how are not having their visas accepted for them to go to India to set up production lines. Machinery tagged for production lines in India is just being held up at customs and saying, we don't want to export this machinery. And the most recent story was that Foxconn Chinese employees that are in India right now are being recalled back to China. So, I mean, that gives you 3 different facets of evidence that the government of China does not want to see these jobs move to India. So, to simplify, consumer backlash and Beijing backlash.
What do you think about Taiwan bringing to the table that nobody else can? And in this new world where geopolitics is basically reshaping everything, what's make Taiwanese company irreplaceable?
And, well, unfortunately, I don't think they are irreplaceable. I mean, obviously, I don't read Taiwanese media as much as I assume you do. My story is very centered on Apple, but there's direct parallels to the major Taiwanese companies, and so you can tell me whether that story is being told. But the Taiwanese companies are being squeezed out of the Apple supply chain by Chinese companies that have learnt all they needed to take over those operations. And because they operate in a different paradigm of party state capitalism rather than a sort of profit first capitalism, they are able to operate at lower margins because they'll work with the state to get certain subsidies, or they will just accept those lower margins because the goal isn't, shareholder dividends. The goal is command and control of industries and to show how much you know. So there are a few instances I note in the book where Luxshare has been in the crosshairs. Luxshare is sort of like the Fox, it's called Little Foxconn sometimes. It's a company that does contract assembly for Apple. Apple's their largest client, but they, it was founded by someone who was one of the earliest workers in Foxconn in, I think, 1988 in mainland China. And so, she's very much learning what she can from Terry Guo. She even plasters the walls of her factories with Terry Guo-like sayings, which is sort of a fun part of the book. So I don't think the Taiwanese are irreplaceable. I think in many cases they've been hired, they've been spied on. There have been lawsuits where these Chinese companies are actually setting up shell companies in Taiwan just to be able to steal talent, right? Poach talent from the Taiwanese people who know it. I mean, all of these skill sets are in the heads of entrepreneurs and people with skill sets. And so I have an instance in the book where somebody would walk out of a factory and there would just be Chinese competitors waiting for the person in the parking lot and saying, give me your paycheck. I'll double your salary on the spot right now. And this was happening all the time from, I think, 2012 onwards, and continues to happen. So no, unfortunately, I don't want to sort of come with the bad news. I don't think there's anything irreplaceable about what the Taiwanese companies have done. I think they've done a magnificent job, clearly. But the writing is on the wall. The Chinese investors are valuing the Chinese competitors to Taiwan at higher valuations. Now, one thing I didn't put in the book, which is a great irony, is that actually companies like Wistron have actually done tremendously well in recent years, because instead of doing work for Apple, which is really low margin, they've actually made this huge play into AI servers. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but I think it's Wistron whose market valuation is in another league, like another echelon than where they've been the last 20 years. And it's because they've been instrumental to this big push among companies like NVIDIA to build massive data servers where the demand is basically insatiable. And so, irony of ironies, it's the Chinese companies that are taking on more of the Apple orders, but that's low margin assembly. Whereas what the Taiwanese companies have done, they've really ridden the artificial intelligence wave. And as a result, some of them have done tremendously well in the last 3 to 5 years.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, I have a couple of lighter questions for you. And
Yeah. Okay.
writing a book of this scope must be incredibly challenging. What was the hardest part of putting Apple and China together? Was it getting people to talk or organize all the things, or something else?
So many things were difficult. So I don't know how to. I'll have to give 2 or 3 answers, and then you can rank how difficult they sound. Um, when I set out to take a year off and write the book, I thought the most difficult thing would be to get inside Apple, right? Even if it's people who have left, it's a very hard company to crack. It's a hard company to get people to tell you their stories. And so I thought I would spend 2 or 3 months really just trying to talk to people. And when that inevitably failed, I was going to then try to tell the story instead through Foxconn, Pegatron, Wistron, all these suppliers. I thought that would be easier. Plan A never failed. I just ended up speaking to way more people than was, frankly speaking, necessary. And I ended up just with so many damn notes that the biggest problem wasn't speaking to people. I thought that would be the biggest problem. The biggest problem was, how the hell do I structure this and put it all together into one coherent book? That was really difficult. So what's nice about the book, I think, as a reader, is that it's short chapters, right? Each chapter takes between maybe 15 and 30 minutes to read. And each chapter, not as a rule, I'm not that strict about it, but it's broken into like 3 parts. So as a reader, there's a sense of accomplishment all the time, right? Because you're always getting to some new subheading, or you're finishing a chapter. And I don't know how other writers work, but for me, that was just because it was such a daunting task that essentially I just made things chronological, but I would divide them into categories and put my notes and structure them that way. And so then I would just write each section as like one little accomplishment after another, and then move on. So that was maybe accidental on my part, but I think what it resulted in was like, there's a certain like density of information. Like each new little section is quite different from the last in how it builds and moves on to something else and gives you a different perspective. But the pacing of the book moves really quickly. So usually a book is either dense, like Rival Partners, which we talked about, but Rival Partners has no pacing, right? It doesn't urge you to read the next chapter. It's a great academic resource, but nobody would call it thrilling. I mean, I love the book, but I wouldn't call it thrilling. And I think the other kind of book you have is where the pacing is good, but it's sort of because it's a light beach read. And so if I'm able to say what I think works about my book, I think it's the combination. It's somehow dense and easy to read and has a suspenseful pace to it. So somehow coming up with that was probably the most difficult thing, coordinating all the information.
Yeah, definitely. I read the Apple and China this big, and I feel thrilling for next trip every single time. And when I read it, I just take a couple weeks to read it. And Rival Partners, only just like 5 or 4 years ago, I read it, and I just like about chapter 1 or 2. It's really hard to read, and actually, when I saw the book you mentioned it, I'm just really surprised you do lots of hard work on that. And are you already thinking about your next book, like Tesla in China? Because honestly, after reading this one, I already excited about what you're taking next.
Thank you. I'm flattered by that. So I use the title Tesla in China as an example of like how sort of like bankrupt my ideas would be if that's what I went with. In other words, like it is sort of an obvious book to write, and if someone writes that book, I would read it myself. But it would be really boring for me to write that because yes, the Tesla stuff would be new, but presumably I'd have to explain the same dynamics, right? All the China stuff would just be old, right? So I wouldn't do that. And I would say it'd be fun to write an article about it, but as you've read the book, you know that there's a good section about Tesla in the book. And so unless I had some breathtakingly new thing to say, I wouldn't do that. So I actually do have an idea for a book. I'm in like the tentative stages of pitching it. But it's so tentative that I don't want to tell anyone about it. So it's not about Apple. It's not really about China. China's maybe a catalyst or something, but it's not. Yeah, it's not really about Apple. It's not really about China, and it shouldn't be. My hero model, I don't know, is when Michael Lewis, I think in 1989, wrote Liar's Poker, which is more or less a memoir about being a Bond salesman at Salomon Brothers. I think his next book was Moneyball. I could be wrong about that, but the point is that's a baseball book. He also wrote a book about Silicon Valley. He also wrote a book about, high frequency trading. I mean, that's sort of the dream, right? Not to sort of double down on Dell in China or Tesla in China, but to do something totally different. So that's the goal right now.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to. And
Thank you.
looking ahead, if someone want to write the sequel to your book in like 5 or 10 years, what should be watching for now?
Well, it's funny. So much has happened even since I finished the manuscript, right? Because I did have, sorry, I submitted the manuscript last September, but then I had several months where I could make certain additions and changes. And so it does include that President Trump had been elected and even maybe the first week or two in office. But of course, the whole tariff war with like the entire world, that hadn't happened. That sort of began in April. So that would be something major. I suppose, whether they can actually pull off the diversification to India. If you just read average media about this, or just mainstream media, whether it's the Wall Street Journal or whatever, I mean, the sentiment seems to be that Apple's making this massive move to India. And people will say things like, oh, every iPhone sold in America next year is going to be built in India. And like the headline can be true, but like none of the details actually really align with that, because that phone that an American buys next year that says made in India is no less dependent on the China-centric supply chain than any other phone ever made by Apple. So if the final step is done in India, you haven't really changed anything. You've gotten around tariff laws, but you haven't actually accomplished a whole lot. And so it'll be fascinating if in 5 or 10 years, Apple's really been able to like replicate. I shouldn't even just say Apple. Apple and India have been able to replicate China's achievements. But I'll tell you one funny thing, which is that not from the book, I don't think, but from interviews I've given, some people get the impression that I'm giving so much credit to Apple and not enough credit to China. And it couldn't be further from the truth. My whole point is that China was a once in a century partner that had all sorts of people that were, willing to move in from the hinterlands to cities like Shenzhen to do the work, to do it sort of for 12 hours a day. The industrial policy was world leading, not in terms of just bringing in capital, but building things, turning just like basic land or like fishing villages into, cities that rival the likes of New York or London that, most Westerners haven't even heard of, but are obviously massive and successful. And even just like on a philosophical level, the way that Chinese capitalism works and functions and is effective. So I'm trying to give so much credit to China that I don't think Apple can do this anywhere else. So it's ironic to be told that I'm not giving China credit, but that's my whole point.
Yeah. Thank you for incredible book and for helping us to see just how Taiwan has been one of the most important business relationship of our time. So thank you, Patrick.
Thanks, Vicky.